The hangar deck of the interstellar carrier Vanguard buzzed with activity as mechanics worked on various ships and equipment, preparing for deep space deployment, and Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison stood beneath a massive quantum drive engine, wiping grease from his dark hands onto his worn coveralls while squinting up at the malfunctioning system that had been giving him trouble for the past 6 hours. And he had spent 12 years working on Starship engines ever since enlisting fresh out of New Houston Technical Academy, where he graduated at the top of his engineering class, and his fingers knew every bolt and circuit and quantum fluctuation pattern like a musician knew their instrument. But this particular drive was different, because something felt wrong in a way he could not quite explain yet. And the hum of the engine carried an unsettling resonance that made his teeth ache slightly whenever he got too close to the dimensional stabilizer array, which should not happen with a properly functioning system. And he was beginning to suspect that the problem was not what the diagnostic readouts were telling him at all. The sharp click of expensive heels on the metal deck plates cut through the mechanical noise around. Him and Jake did not look up because he recognized that particular sound belonging to Victoria Crane, who had arrived on the Vanguard 3 days ago as the newly appointed CEO of Stellar Dynamics Corporation, which was the private military contractor that had built half the fleet's propulsion systems. And she came with an entire entourage of assistants and lawyers and corporate security personnel who seemed to get in everyone's way, while she conducted what she called an inspection tour of her company's investments. Though what she really seemed to be doing was making life harder for everyone on the ship by questioning every procedure and criticizing every aspect of the military's maintenance protocols. Her expensive heels stopped directly beside his toolbox, and Jake continued calibrating the quantum flux compensator, with his fingers dancing across the holographic interface that projected from his wrist terminal, showing him data streams that most people would not understand, but which told him everything about the engine's current state. And he knew she was standing there waiting for him to acknowledge her presence. But he wanted to finish this particular calibration sequence before it timed out and forced him to start over from the beginning. You there? Victoria's voice came out sharp and cold like broken glass cutting through air, and she added the word mechanic with a tone that somehow made it sound like an insult rather than a job description. And Jake finally looked up to see her standing with her arms crossed over her tailored gray suit that somehow remained completely pristine, despite the industrial grime covering everything else in the hangar, and her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun that matched her severe expression, and her green eyes looked at him with the particular kind of contempt that came from someone who had inherited a billion-dollar company rather than building anything themselves. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison, ma'am," Jake said quietly while tapping the rank insignia on his collar, to remind her that he was a commissioned officer and not just some random enlisted mechanic, though he knew from experience that people like Victoria Crane rarely cared about such distinctions when they had already decided someone was beneath them. She waved a dismissive hand in the air as if brushing away his correction, like it was an annoying insect, and said whatever, before continuing that the engine had been down for 6 hours already, and her engineers had examined it remotely through the diagnostic systems and declared that it could not be fixed without replacing the entire quantum core, which would take 3 weeks and cost the Navy 14 million credits. And she seemed almost pleased about this news, as if the expensive repair contract would be good for her company's bottom line. Jake stood slowly to his full height, matching her eye level, and he was a big man with broad shoulders built from years of hauling heavy equipment and working in cramped engine spaces. But he moved with careful deliberation that came from working around delicate and dangerous machinery for over a decade, and he said respectfully that her engineers were looking at the problem incorrectly because the core was fine, and the real issue was in the dimensional stabilizer array. And if she gave him another hour, he could have it fixed properly without needing any expensive replacement. Parts Victoria's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile but more like a smirk, and Jake noticed that several of her assistants had gathered behind her, along with a handful of other crew members who were pretending to work on nearby equipment while actually watching this confrontation unfold. And he felt the weight of all their attention pressing down on him and knew that whatever happened next would be remembered and talked about throughout the ship. "Another hour," she repeated slowly, as if tasting the words and finding them amusing, and her voice dripped with mockery as she continued that he thought he could fix in 1 hour what her top engineers with all their advanced training and expensive equipment had declared impossible. and she looked at him like he was a child claiming he could fly to the moon by flapping his arms hard enough. "Yes, ma'am," Jake said simply because he knew he could fix it, and he had already identified the real problem days ago, but had been waiting for the right diagnostic tools to confirm his suspicions before making any repairs that might void the warranty or violate military maintenance protocols. Victoria laughed, and it was not a kind sound but rather harsh and mocking, and she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear that she would make him a deal and tell him what would happen if he could actually fix this engine in 1 hour and truly fix it. She emphasized not some temporary patch job that would fail again in a week, but a real permanent repair that would pass all diagnostic tests, and she paused for dramatic effect while looking around at the growing crowd before saying that if he succeeded, she would do something extraordinary and marry him right there on the spot. The hangar went completely silent except for the ambient hum of machinery, and every eye was now openly staring at them. And Jake felt his jaw tighten because he recognized exactly what this was, and it was the same game that people had played his entire career, making assumptions about him based on the color of his skin and where he came from, and deciding that he must be less capable and less intelligent and less worthy of respect than people who looked different or came from wealthy families. And Victoria. Crane was trying to turn him into a joke in front of his crew and his shipmates, who he had worked alongside for years, earning their trust and respect through competence and dedication. But Jake Morrison had not survived 12 years in the Navy by backing down from people like Victoria Crane, and he had not earned his commission from enlisted ranks by being intimidated by wealth or corporate power, and he had not become the fleet's lead propulsion specialist by accepting other people's low expectations. And he met her eyes steadily without flinching and said that he did not need an hour before checking his chronometer and adding that she should give him 3 minutes instead. Now genuine surprise flickered across Victoria's face, for just a moment before being quickly replaced by renewed contempt, and she said that 3 minutes was completely impossible, and that he was obviously bluffing and making wild claims he could not possibly back up just to save face in front of the crew. "Then you have nothing to worry about, do you, ma'am?" Jake said calmly and turned back to the engine without waiting for her response, because he had work to do and a point to prove, and 3 minutes to do it in. Jake's hands moved across the holographic interface with practiced precision and speed, while the crowd around him continued to grow larger as word spread through the ship's internal communication networks that a billionaire CEO had just made a marriage bet with a mechanic over whether he could fix an impossible problem in just 3 minutes. And Captain Helen Rodriguez pushed through the gathering crowd, with her expression hovering somewhere between amusement and concern as she approached the scene and asked what exactly was happening here in her hangar. And Jake did not look up from his work, while his fingers flew through diagnostic sequences as he explained that Ms. Crane had wagered he could not repair the quantum drive in 3 minutes, and he had accepted the challenge. The captain's eyebrows rose toward her hairline as she glanced over at Victoria, who stood with her arms still crossed and radiating absolute confidence like someone who had just made a bet they knew they could not possibly lose, and the captain said she was not sure this was entirely appropriate, given the circumstances. But Victoria interrupted coolly to explain that she had simply been making a point about the general incompetence of military maintenance crews, and this mechanic had taken offense at her professional assessment and made a foolish claim that he could fix what her engineers had declared unfixable, and she had merely called his bluff with a little joke to teach him a lesson about humility. 2 minutes 30 seconds announced someone in the crowd who had apparently taken it upon themselves to serve as official timekeeper for this impromptu competition, and the tension in the hangar continued to build as more crew members abandoned their workstations to watch what was happening. Jake had already identified the real problem several days ago when he first started working on this particular engine, and he knew the dimensional stabilizer array was not actually broken or malfunctioning in any genuine sense, but rather it had been deliberately miscalibrated, and the miscalibration was so precise and so carefully implemented that it had to be intentional sabotage rather than any kind of accident or random failure, and someone with deep knowledge of these systems had accessed them and made specific changes designed to create a failure pattern that would convince most engineers the quantum core itself was damaged beyond repair. His fingers continued dancing across the quantum field readouts as he worked, and the engine's problem was actually quite elegant in its deception. because a casual observer looking at the diagnostic screens would see what appeared to be catastrophic core degradation, with the dimensional stabilizers outputting error codes that suggested quantum decay was occurring at an accelerating rate, and any stellar dynamics engineer following standard procedures would run their diagnostics and see those error codes and immediately recommend a complete core replacement without looking any deeper into the actual cause. But Jake knew these engines better than the people who had originally designed them, because he had lived with them through actual combat situations and emergency jumps and all kinds of scenarios that corporate engineers would never experience outside of carefully controlled simulations. And he knew the subtle differences between genuine mechanical failure and artificially induced error cascades that were designed to look like failure. 2 minutes called out the timekeeper, and Jake continued working methodically because he knew exactly what needed to be done, and he had done similar repairs before, though never quite this publicly or with this much pressure and attention focused on him. He isolated the stabilizer array from the main quantum loop and initiated a hard reset of all its calibration protocols because the array's firmware had been modified to accept faulty parameters as if they were correct values, and he needed to bypass that corrupted firmware entirely and restore the original factory settings that the system had shipped with years ago when it was first installed. His wrist terminal beeped softly as he accessed the arrays core programming through a maintenance backdoor that most mechanics did not even know existed, because it was not mentioned in any of the official documentation or training manuals, but he had learned about it from Chief Warrant Officer Patricia Johnson during his very first deployment when he was still a young third-class petty officer, fresh out of technical school, and she had been maintaining quantum drives since before he was born, and she knew every hidden access point and undocumented feature that the engineers had built into these systems for emergency field repairs. "This is completely absurd," Victoria muttered loud enough for people nearby to hear, and she added that he was obviously just randomly pressing buttons and hoping something would work, and that there was no way he actually knew what he was doing. Captain Rodriguez said nothing in response, but her eyes remained fixed on Jake's hands as he worked, because she had been commanding ships long enough to recognize real competence when she saw it, and she knew the difference between someone who was faking knowledge and someone who genuinely understood what they were doing. 1 minute 30 seconds announced the timekeeper, and several people in the crowd were now making quiet bets with each other about whether Jake would actually succeed or fail. Jake purged the corrupted firmware from the dimensional stabilizer array and initiated a clean installation from the backup files that were stored in the ship's main engineering database, and the array would need approximately 43 seconds to recalibrate itself against the quantum core's current operating parameters. But that process was completely automatic once it started, and did not require any additional input from him. He stepped back from the control console and crossed his arms while watching the progress indicator climb steadily on his holographic display, and the crowd pressed closer, trying to see what he was looking at and understand what was happening with the repair 1 minute called the timekeeper, and the tension in the hangar had become almost physical, like electricity in the air before a lightning storm. The quantum drive's hum began to change in pitch and quality as the recalibration process continued, and the unsettling resonance that had plagued the engine for days gradually smoothed out into the steady, reliable thrum of a properly functioning propulsion system, and diagnostic indicator lights that had been showing amber warnings for hours suddenly flickered and began turning green one after another, in rapid succession. Victoria's supremely confident expression developed its first crack as she stepped forward and stared at the status displays with visible confusion, because this was not supposed to be possible according to everything her engineers had told her. 30 seconds announced the timekeeper. The recalibration sequence completed successfully, and Jake pulled up the full diagnostic suite on his interface and ran a comprehensive system check that examined every single parameter and specification of the quantum drive's operation, and every single reading came back green, showing optimal performance, and quantum coherence was perfect, and dimensional stability was exactly where it should be. And the engine was not just barely functional, but was actually performing better than it had in months, because all the minor inefficiencies that had built up over time had been cleared away, along with the sabotaged settings. 10 seconds called the timekeeper, and the entire crowd seemed to hold its breath. Jake turned to face Victoria Crane directly and said formally that the engine was now completely fixed with full functionality. Restored, and asked if she would like to verify the diagnostic results herself before the time expired. The timekeeper's voice rang out clearly through the silent hangar, announcing that time was up at exactly 2 minutes and 47 seconds. Hangar absolutely erupted into applause and cheering and whistling as the crew celebrated what they had just witnessed, and Victoria Crane stood frozen in place, with her face cycling rapidly through expressions of disbelief and anger and something that might have been genuine fear as she realized the implications of what had just happened. The cheering gradually died down as everyone in the hangar waited to see what would happen next, and Victoria's assistants clustered around her, speaking in urgent whispers while she continued staring at the diagnostic displays as if hoping they would suddenly change and show different results. And Captain Rodriguez stepped forward with her command presence cutting through the remaining noise and said that it certainly appeared Lieutenant Commander Morrison had successfully met the challenge, that Ms. Crane had presented. Victoria's mouth opened and closed several times without any words coming out, and her face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and she finally managed to say that this whole situation was completely ridiculous, because it had obviously been just a joke and nobody had actually expected him to succeed at fixing something her engineers had declared impossible. It did not sound much like a joke, ma'am, said Lieutenant Sarah Park, who was the assistant chief engineer, and she spoke up from somewhere in the crowd, adding that Victoria had made what appeared to be a formal wager in front of more than 200 witnesses, and they were currently on a military vessel where verbal contracts and agreements carried full legal weight under interstellar maritime law. Jake finally spoke, and his voice was quiet but clear enough to carry through the suddenly silent hangar, as he said that he did not actually want to marry Victoria. Crane Victoria blinked at him in obvious confusion and asked what he meant. Jake said again that he did not want to marry her and then stepped slightly closer to her, though not in any threatening way, but simply to make sure everyone could hear what he was about to say. And he told her that what he really wanted was for her to understand 3 very important things. He held up one finger and said first that the engine had never actually been broken in any real sense, because someone had deliberately sabotaged it, and that someone had used Stellar Dynamics' proprietary maintenance access codes to remotely change the calibration settings on the dimensional stabilizer array in a way that made it appear as though the quantum core had suffered catastrophic failure when in reality, the core was perfectly fine. And this sabotage would have forced the Navy to contract with her company for a completely unnecessary 14 million credit repair job. A wave of surprised muttering ran through the assembled crowd, and Victoria's face went from pale white to angry red as she said that he was making a very serious accusation. Jake said calmly that it was not merely an accusation but rather a provable fact, and he suggested that Captain Rodriguez check the fleet maintenance logs, because she would discover that this exact same failure pattern had occurred on 7 other ships in the fleet during just the past 6 months, and all of those ships were equipped with Stellar Dynamics quantum drives, and all of them had required 14 million credit core replacements, and all of these failures had occurred right before their scheduled contract renewal dates, which was far too much of a coincidence to be accidental. Captain Rodriguez's expression hardened noticeably as she pulled out her command tablet and began accessing the fleet-wide maintenance databases, while one of Victoria's assistants was already speaking urgently into a communication device trying to reach someone. Jake held up a second finger and said that Victoria had come into this hangar and attempted to humiliate him publicly because she had made certain assumptions about him, and she had created her little marriage joke because she apparently believed there was absolutely no way that a military mechanic could possibly understand her company's advanced technology better than her expensive corporate engineers, especially when that mechanic happened to look like him. Victoria said nothing in response, but her jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like her teeth might crack from the pressure. Jake continued by explaining what Victoria had not known about him, which was that before joining the Navy, he had spent 4 years studying at New Houston Technical Academy, where he graduated at the very top of his class in quantum engineering. And during his time there, he had published 2 academic papers on dimensional stability and faster-than-light propulsion systems, and one of those papers had actually been cited in the patent application for the exact model of quantum drive that was currently hanging in the air above them. He paused to let that information fully sink in before continuing, that her engineers were undoubtedly good at what they did, but they were corporate engineers who knew textbook solutions and approved procedures, and they had never experienced the reality of keeping a quantum drive operational during actual combat when half the ship's power systems were offline and the dimensional stabilizers were failing, or making emergency repairs in zero gravity, while enemy railguns were firing at the ship or troubleshooting a critical drive malfunction in the middle of an emergency hyperspace jump, when one wrong calculation would scatter the ship and everyone aboard across 14 different dimensional planes. Jake's voice remained completely level and professional, but there was unmistakable steel beneath the calm surface as he said that he had personally done all of those things and more during his 12 years of service, and he had accumulated field experience that her corporate engineers would never gain because they worked in clean, safe facilities and never had to deal with real emergencies, and he knew these quantum drives not just as mechanical systems, but as living, breathing machines that required intuition and feel, and sometimes had to be coaxed and fought with and begged to keep running when everything else around them was falling. Apart, he raised a third finger and said that the most important thing Victoria needed to understand was that respect was not something automatically given based on wealth or position or corporate title, but rather something that had to be earned through actual competence and dedication in how a person chose to treat other people, and he acknowledged that she had inherited a billion-dollar company from her father. And that was fine, and he was happy for her, but that inheritance did not make her inherently better than anyone else on this ship. Jake gestured around at all the assembled crew members and said that every single person in this hangar, from the lowest-ranking technician all the way up to Captain Rodriguez, had earned their position through genuine hard work and demonstrated skill. And these were the people who kept the ship running day after day, and they maintained the life support systems that kept 2,000 crew members breathing, and they repaired damaged hull plating after combat, and they calibrated weapon systems and monitored reactor cores, and they performed 1,000 different jobs that nobody ever saw or appreciated, and they did all of this knowing that even one small mistake could potentially kill everyone aboard the vessel. He looked directly at Victoria and said that when she walked into this hangar and casually dismissed a mechanic as incompetent without knowing anything at all about that person's background or training or experience, she was not just insulting him personally, but rather she was insulting every single person who put on a uniform and did the hard and dirty and dangerous work of keeping humanity's entire fleet operational. And that was something he absolutely could not allow to pass without response. The silence in the hangar was so complete that people could probably hear each other breathing, and Victoria stood with her fists clenched at her sides, and her face showed a mixture of humiliation and rage, and around her the assistants looked deeply uncomfortable, while many of the ship's crew were nodding in agreement with everything Jake had said. Captain Rodriguez looked up from her tablet and announced that Lieutenant Commander Morrison's assessment about the sabotage appeared to be completely correct because the fleet maintenance logs clearly showed a pattern of identical failures across multiple vessels, and all of these failures were associated with stellar dynamics equipment, and she was immediately forwarding all of this information to Fleet Command and to the Judge Advocate General's office for investigation. She turned to Victoria and said formally that Ms. Crane and all of her representatives would be required to remain on this vessel until further notice, and that their access to external communication systems was being temporarily suspended pending the investigation, and she called for Marines to escort Ms. Crane and her entire staff to temporary quarters for Marines. Emerged from the crowd with professionally neutral expressions, and Victoria looked like she wanted to argue, but one glance at the captain's face made it clear that would be completely pointless, as the Marines led Victoria and her entourage away. From the hangar, she shot one final look of pure hatred at Jake, but he met her eyes steadily with his expression remaining completely calm. When they were gone, the hangar stayed quiet for just another moment before someone started clapping, and then others joined in, and within seconds the applause became absolutely deafening. 3 hours after the confrontation in the hangar, Jake sat in the chief engineer's office nursing a cup of truly terrible coffee, while Lieutenant Commander Alan Cruz, who was the ship's chief engineer, leaned back in his chair with a huge grin on his face and told Jake that he had just become a fleet legend, and by tomorrow morning, everyone from Earth all the way out to the outer colonies would have heard this story. Jake groaned and rubbed his face with both hands and said that becoming famous was exactly what he had not wanted to happen. Alan laughed and said too bad because Jake was stuck with it now, and there was no way to put this particular genie back in the bottle. And then his expression turned more serious as he asked whether Jake really believed that Stellar Dynamics had been deliberately sabotaging their own equipment to force expensive repair contracts. Jake said he was absolutely certain of it, because the pattern was far too consistent to be coincidental, and the sabotage itself was too sophisticated to be random failures, and clearly someone with very deep knowledge of the quantum drive systems was deliberately creating failures that appeared catastrophic but were actually easily fixable if you knew where to look. Alan whistled softly and said, "That was fraud on a truly massive scale, and if the Navy could prove it in court, then Stellar Dynamics would lose every single government contract they had, and the company would essentially be finished." "Jake," said Good in a flat voice, and added that if they were sabotaging military vessels for profit, then they deserved to be finished because people's lives depended on these systems working correctly. The door opened, and Captain Rodriguez entered, followed by two officers Jake did not recognize, and they wore the insignia of Fleet Intelligence on their uniforms. The captain said formally that these were Commander Lisa Chen and Lieutenant Nathan Brooks from Fleet Intelligence, and they had some questions about Jake's analysis of the quantum drive failures. Jake stood and shook hands with the intelligence officers, and he noticed that Commander Chen was a small, intense woman with sharp eyes that seemed to miss absolutely nothing, while Lieutenant Brooks was younger and carried a portable data terminal. Commander Chen said without any preamble that they needed Jake to walk them through exactly how he had identified the sabotage, and they wanted every technical detail because they needed to build a case that would hold up in a military tribunal. For the next 2 hours, Jake explained all the technical details of the dimensional stabilizer sabotage, and he showed them the modified firmware and the false error codes, and explained how the system was specifically designed to fail in a way that would convince most engineers the quantum core was damaged beyond any hope of repair. Commander Chen listened with intense focus and occasionally asked questions that clearly demonstrated she understood the technology far better than most flag officers ever would, and Lieutenant Brooks recorded everything with his fingers flying rapidly across his data terminal. Chen finally said that this was excellent work, and Jake had essentially handed them a complete case, and they had already started analyzing the other affected ships, and the pattern matched his analysis perfectly. She paused and exchanged a meaningful look with Brooks before asking how Jake had known to look for sabotage in the first place, because most mechanics would have simply accepted the diagnostic error messages at face value. Jake shrugged and explained that the errors simply had not made sense because a quantum core does not degrade in the way the diagnostics were claiming, and the pattern was all wrong, and it looked like someone had taken a real legitimate failure mode and deliberately exaggerated it to make it appear more dramatic than it should be, and that inconsistency had made him suspicious enough to dig deeper. Chen asked how he just happened to know how to bypass the corrupted firmware and restore the factory settings. Jake explained that he had learned that particular trick from Chief Warrant Officer Patricia Johnson when he was just a young third-class petty officer, and she had known every backdoor and maintenance protocol in the quantum drive systems, and she always said that engineers left hidden access points for emergency field repairs, and you just had to know where to look for them. Chen smiled slightly and said that Chief Johnson was something of a legend in engineering circles, and she was very glad that Johnson had passed on her knowledge to people like Jake. And then she closed her tablet and thanked him and said he might have just saved the Navy hundreds of millions of credits and possibly prevented a catastrophic failure during actual combat operations. After the intelligence officers left, Captain Rodriguez remained in the office, and she looked at Jake for a long, quiet moment. She said that had been quite an impressive speech he gave in the hangar earlier. Jake felt his stomach tighten and said he apologized if he had overstepped because he probably should not have dressed down a civilian contractor in front of the entire crew. Rodriguez shook her head and said no apology was necessary, because everything he said had needed to be said, and Victoria Crane had walked onto her ship and openly disrespected her crew, and Jake had defended them, which was exactly what a good officer should do. She paused and then said that Jake also needed to understand that he had just made a very powerful enemy, because Stellar Dynamics might be facing criminal charges. But Victoria Crane, personally, had enormous resources and connections, and even if the company went down, she would probably land on her feet somehow, and she struck Rodriguez as the kind of person who held grudges for a very long time. Jake said he could handle it. Rodriguez said she was sure he could, but he should watch his back anyway, and then she moved toward the door but stopped and turned back to say that he had done well on all of it. The investigation moved with surprising speed over the following weeks as fleet intelligence descended on the Vanguard and 6 other ships that had reported similar quantum drive failures, and teams of forensic engineers carefully tore apart the dimensional stabilizer arrays while documenting every piece of evidence of the deliberate sabotage. Jake found himself pulled away from his regular maintenance duties to serve as a technical consultant, and he spent long days in briefing rooms explaining quantum drive architecture to lawyers and admirals who had never, personally, touched a wrench in their entire lives, and he rebuilt timelines and analyzed maintenance logs and demonstrated exactly how the sabotage had been implemented across multiple vessels. The evidence that accumulated was absolutely damning because every single affected ship showed exactly the same pattern, and the dimensional stabilizers had been remotely accessed using stellar dynamics. Administrative security codes and the firmware modifications were identical across all vessels, and the timing of the failures consistently aligned with contract renewal periods. What the investigation also revealed was that Victoria Crane had not actually been the original architect of the sabotage scheme because she had only inherited the company 6 months earlier when her father died, and the sabotage had actually been ongoing for over 2 years before she took control. And the real culprits were 3 senior engineers in the Stellar Dynamics Maintenance Division who had been implementing the plan to artificially inflate repair costs and maximize company profits. But Victoria's role was definitely not innocent either, because when she took over the company, the engineers had brought her into the scheme, and internal communications showed that she had not only approved the continuing sabotage, but had actively suggested expanding it to additional systems to maximize the profits they could extract, and her legal defense that she had simply been following established company practices fell completely flat when prosecutors produced emails showing her enthusiastically planning future sabotage operations and calculating expected profit margins. 3 weeks after the hangar confrontation, Jake was called to testify before a military tribunal, and the hearing was held in a secure facility on Mars Central Command, and the room was austere and dominated by a long table where 5 senior flag officers sat in judgment of the case. Victoria Crane sat at the defendant's table surrounded by 4 expensive lawyers, and she looked somehow diminished compared to how she had appeared on the Vanguard, and her expensive suit could not mask the strain of the past weeks, and when Jake entered the room, she glared at him with absolutely undisguised hatred. Jake took the witness stand and was formally sworn in, and the prosecutor, who was a sharp-faced commander named Gregory Hill, led him methodically through his testimony, and Jake explained how he had identified the sabotage and provided all the technical details of the firmware modification, and described the pattern of failures across the entire fleet. Victoria's lead defense attorney, who was an older man with silver hair, attempted to discredit Jake during his cross-examination by suggesting that Jake had fabricated the evidence because of personal animosity toward Victoria, and he implied that the sabotage was actually accidental and just the result of legitimate engineering mistakes, rather than deliberate criminal actions. Jake remained completely calm and answered each question with precise technical language, and when the attorney tried to confuse him with complex engineering terminology, Jake simply explained the concepts clearly until even the flag officers sitting at the bench were nodding in understanding. The turning point came when the prosecutor introduced Victoria's own emails as evidence, and the tribunal watched as message. The tribunal deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict, and they found Victoria Crane guilty on all charges, including conspiracy to defraud the military and endangering naval vessels and multiple violations of federal contractor regulations, and the 3 engineers who had originally implemented the scheme had already pled guilty weeks earlier and were facing substantial prison sentences. But Victoria's lawyers had gambled on taking the case to trial, and they had lost badly. Sentencing came down exactly 1 week later, and Victoria received 5 years in federal prison, along with complete forfeiture of all assets and profits that had been gained from the fraudulent activities, and she was permanently disbarred from ever holding any position with any company that did business with any government agency. And Stellar Dynamics Corporation had all of its contracts immediately terminated, and was forced into bankruptcy liquidation proceedings. Jake did not attend the sentencing hearing because he was already back on the Vanguard where he belonged, and his hands were deep inside another engine problem that needed solving. The Stellar Dynamics scandal sent enormous shockwaves through the entire military-industrial complex, and congressional oversight committees launched investigations into numerous other defense contractors, and Fleet Command implemented strict new verification protocols for all maintenance diagnostics, and the Navy established an independent engineering review board whose job was to audit contractor recommendations before any major repairs were approved. But the biggest impact of the whole situation was actually cultural rather than procedural, because the story of a mechanic exposing massive corporate fraud and publicly defending his crew spread through the fleet like wildfire, and videos of the hangar confrontation had been recorded by multiple crew members on their personal devices, and the footage was leaked to news networks despite official attempts to keep the incident quiet, and Jake became an unwilling symbol of enlisted competence and officer integrity throughout human space. Jake absolutely hated all the attention, and he tried his best to keep his head down and focus on his actual work, but it proved completely impossible to avoid, and junior officers kept asking for his autograph, and mechanics on other ships sent him messages thanking him for standing up for them, and someone even started selling unofficial merchandise, including shirts with Jake's rank insignia, and the slogan 3 minutes printed below it in bold letters. Captain Rodriguez found the entire situation rather amusing, and one morning she called Jake to her ready room and presented him with one of the unofficial shirts as a gift. She said, grinning, that she thought he should have one of these for posterity, and maybe to wear on casual days. Jake looked at the shirt and sighed deeply, and said that he really wished this would all just go away, and people would forget about it. Rodriguez laughed and said it definitely would not go away because he was stuck being famous now, so he might as well embrace it and make the best of the situation. But then her expression became more serious, and she said there was something else they needed to discuss. Because Fleet Command wanted to promote him. Jake blinked in surprise and asked what she meant. She explained that Fleet Command was offering him an immediate promotion to full commander along with a prestigious position at Fleet Engineering Command on Earth, and he would be heading up a brand new division that was specifically focused on contractor oversight and technical verification, and essentially, his job would be making absolutely sure that another Stellar Dynamics situation could never happen again. Jake felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest because a promotion to commander was huge, and a position at Fleet Command was even more significant, and it was exactly the kind of career opportunity that most officers spent their entire lives dreaming about. He said he appreciated the offer very much, but he was going to have to decline it. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow and asked if he was actually turning down both a promotion and a comfortable desk job at Fleet Command, and did he have any idea how many officers would gladly kill for that kind of position? Jake said he was sure many officers would want it, but that was not why he had joined the Navy in the first place, and he had not become an engineer to sit in an office reviewing paperwork all day, and he had become an engineer because he wanted to work on actual engines and keep ships running and solve real problems in the field. And he told the captain directly that he belonged in the hangar deck and not in some conference room on Earth. Rodriguez studied him carefully for a long moment, and then she smiled and said that was exactly the answer she had been hoping to hear, and Fleet Command would probably be disappointed. But she would fully back his decision because this ship needed him far more than some office did. Jake thanked her, and 2 months after the tribunal, the Vanguard received new deployment orders, and they were being sent to the frontier regions to patrol the border with an aggressive alien species called the Kravik, and it was considered dangerous duty far from the comfortable safety of the inner systems in territory where combat was a very real and constant possibility. Jake could not have been happier about the assignment because this was exactly what he had signed up for when he joined the Navy, and it meant real missions and real challenges and the chance to use his skills where they truly mattered most. The deployment proved to be everything Jake had hoped it would be, and the frontier was harsh and completely unforgiving, and the Vanguard encountered Kravik raiders on multiple occasions and navigated through unstable jump points and operated for weeks at a time without any resupply, and the quantum drives were constantly pushed to their absolute limits. And Jake absolutely thrived in those conditions because he kept the engines running through situations that would have completely defeated lesser mechanics. And when a Kravik ambush damaged the port quantum drive during a fierce firefight, Jake improvised repairs right in the middle of active combat by routing power through auxiliary systems that had never been designed to carry that kind of load. And when the starboard drive developed a dangerous dimensional resonance cascade during an emergency jump, Jake manually recalibrated it while the ship was still actively in transit between dimensional planes, which was a feat that most engineers considered theoretically impossible. His crew genuinely worshipped him, and the mechanics who worked under Jake's supervision learned more in 6 months of frontier deployment than they had during their previous years of service combined, and he taught them not just standard procedures but real understanding about how to feel a quantum drive's rhythm, and how to anticipate problems before they became critical, and how to think 3 steps ahead when everything around them was falling apart. One night, after a particularly brutal engagement with Kravik forces, Jake sat alone in the nearly empty mess hall, nursing yet another cup of terrible coffee, and Lieutenant Sarah Parks slid into the seat directly across from him. She said that when he had turned down the promotion to stay with the ship, she had honestly thought he was completely crazy. But now she understood why he made that choice, because this was clearly where he truly belonged. Jake smiled tiredly and said that fleet command positions were certainly important, and someone definitely needed to do that administrative work. But it was not him, and he needed to be in a place where his hands were actually on the engines, where he could make a direct and immediate difference. Sarah said that she was very glad he was here with them because they would all be dead at least 3 times over, if not for his skills and dedication. Jake said he was just doing his job like everyone. Sarah shook her head firmly and said, "No, he was doing far more than just his job, and he was showing all of them what real excellence looked like and what it truly meant to be a professional." And she paused before asking if he ever thought about that day with Victoria Crane and about how it all started. Jake considered the question carefully and said he thought about it sometimes, and mostly he wondered what had driven Victoria to become the way she was and where that arrogance came from, and that assumption that wealth and position automatically meant she was superior to everyone else. Sarah said that now Victoria was in prison, serving her sentence. Jake said that she was in prison because she had committed serious crimes and not simply because she was arrogant, and the arrogance had just made it easier for her to convince herself that the crimes were somehow acceptable. And he finished his coffee and said he hoped she would learn something meaningful from the experience. But honestly, he did not think about her very much anymore because he had far more important things to worry about. The Vanguard continued its patrol along the frontier, and Jake continued working in the engine room doing what he did best, and his reputation continued to grow throughout the fleet, but he remained focused on the work itself rather than the fame, and he trained his crew and maintained the quantum drives and solved problems as they arose, and he was content with his choice to stay where he belonged rather than accepting a promotion that would have taken him away from the work he loved most. Months passed, and the ship and crew performed brilliantly under difficult conditions, and Jake took quiet satisfaction in knowing that he was making a real difference in a place where his skills and experience truly mattered, and he had no regrets whatsoever about turning down the desk. 18 months after the tribunal, the Vanguard finally returned to Earth for a scheduled refit, and the ship had definitely earned its rest, because battle damage from multiple Kravik engagements had scarred the hull, and the quantum drives desperately needed complete overhauls, and the crew was exhausted but also very proud of what they had accomplished. Jake supervised the careful transfer of the drives to the shipyard maintenance facilities, and he made absolutely sure that every detail of their extensive service history was properly documented, because he wanted the civilian contractors to understand exactly what these engines had been through. And he was in the middle of briefing a group of contractors when his personal communicator suddenly buzzed with an urgent message from Captain Rodriguez. She said she needed him at the main gangway immediately. Jake said he was on his way, and he made his way through the busy shipyard, wondering what kind of crisis had erupted now and when. He reached the gangway. He found Captain Rodriguez standing there with Lieutenant Park and 2 people Jake had never expected to see. The first was an older man in civilian clothes who appeared to be perhaps 60 years old, with iron-gray hair and the deeply weathered look of someone who had spent many decades working in space. And the second was a young woman in her early 20s who wore a student jumpsuit from the Interstellar Engineering Consortium. Captain Rodriguez said formally that These were Daniel Crane and his daughter Nicole Crane, and they had specifically asked to speak with Jake. Jake felt his stomach sink because Crane was Victoria's family name, and he had known this confrontation might eventually come, though he had honestly hoped to avoid it. Daniel Crane extended his hand toward Jake and said that he appreciated Jake agreeing to see them. Jake shook the offered hand cautiously and said he was not aware he had actually agreed to anything, but he was willing to listen to what they had to say. Daniel said that was all he was asking for, and then he glanced at Captain Rodriguez and asked if they might have a few minutes of privacy. Rodriguez looked at Jake, who nodded slightly to indicate it was okay, and she and Park withdrew to a polite distance, though Jake noticed they remained close enough to intervene quickly if the situation became problematic. Daniel took a deep breath and said that he had come here to apologize both for his daughter Victoria and for the company he had built and for everything that had happened. Jake blinked in surprise because whatever he had expected, this was definitely not. Daniel explained that he had founded Stellar Dynamics 30 years ago and built it up from a small fabrication shop into one of the premier defense contractors in the entire system, and he had been genuinely proud of that work and proud of the technology they developed, and the drives they built had saved lives and helped humanity expand into the galaxy. His voice grew heavy as he continued that somewhere along the way either the company had changed or maybe he had changed, and he became so intensely focused on growth and profits and beating the competition that he stopped paying attention to what they were actually doing. And he had not personally implemented the sabotage scheme, but he had definitely created the corporate culture that made it possible because he had taught his people that profit was more important than integrity. He said that when he got sick, he handed the company over to Victoria because she was his eldest daughter, and he thought she was ready for the responsibility. But he realized now that he had trained her in all the worst parts of business, including the ruthlessness and the willingness to cut corners and the contempt for people who worked with their hands instead of manipulating spreadsheets. Daniel looked directly at Jake and said he had watched the video of what happened in the hangar and watched his daughter mock Jake and dismiss him and try to humiliate him publicly. And he was deeply ashamed because he realized that he had made Victoria that way through his own example, and he had taught her to think that money and position made her automatically better than everyone else. He said quietly that he was not asking for forgiveness, because what Victoria did was genuinely criminal, and what the company did was criminal, and they deserved the consequences. But he wanted Jake to know that not everyone in his family shared those toxic values. He gestured to Nicole, who had been silent up until this point, and explained that this was his younger daughter, and she had been away at engineering school when everything happened. And when she found out what Victoria had done, she immediately dropped out of the consortium and enlisted in the Navy. Nicole spoke for the first time, and her voice was quiet, but steady, as she said that she had watched Jake's testimony at the tribunal, and the way he explained the technical details with such clarity and passion, and how he defended his crew and showed what real integrity looked like. And she had decided that if she was going to be an engineer, she wanted to be the kind of engineer that Jake was, meaning someone who actually builds things and fixes things and genuinely cares about the work itself, rather than just the profit margin. She pulled out a small data storage chip and explained that she had also spent the last year going through all the Stellar Dynamics records she could access, and she had found extensive documentation of how the sabotage had been implemented, along with internal communications between the engineers and everything else. And she had turned it all over to the prosecutors, and it had helped ensure that Victoria and her co-conspirators received the maximum possible sentences. Nicole handed the chip to Jake and said these were copies of everything, and they contained technical specifications for every system that Stellar Dynamics had sabotaged or compromised, and she thought the Navy's engineers might want them to make absolutely sure there were not any other hidden problems lurking in the systems. Jake took the chip feeling somewhat stunned and said she did not have to do any of this. Nicole said firmly that yes, she did, because her family had caused enormous damage to the Navy and to people who risked their lives defending humanity every day, and the least she could do was try to help fix some of that damage. And she straightened her posture and added that she was shipping out for basic training in 2 weeks, and after that she was hoping to qualify for the engineering program, and maybe someday she would be good enough to work on a ship like the Vanguard. Jake looked at this young woman who had given up a privileged life to try to make amends for her family's crimes, and he thought about the difficult path ahead of her, because basic training would be brutal, and the engineering program even more so, and she would face constant questions and suspicion because of her family name. But he also saw genuine determination in her eyes, and the kind of deep commitment that could not be faked. Jake said slowly that, when she finished her training, if she still wanted to be a ship engineer, she should let him know, and he would see if they could get her assigned to the Vanguard, because their engineering division could definitely use someone with her background, and more importantly, her integrity. Nicole's eyes widened in surprise, and she asked if he would really do that after everything that had happened. Jake said that she was not responsible for her sister's crimes, and she had already proven she was willing to do the right thing even when it cost her significantly, and that was exactly the kind of person he wanted on his crew. And besides, someone who understood stellar dynamic systems as thoroughly as she did would be extremely valuable, because there were probably a dozen other problems lurking in those drives that they had not found yet. Daniel Crane's eyes were suspiciously bright, and he thanked Jake and said that meant more than Jake could possibly know. Jake said not to thank him yet because ship life was extremely hard, and he was a very demanding supervisor, and Nicole would have to earn her place, just like everyone else on the crew. Nicole said firmly that she would not want it any other way. After the Cranes left, Captain Rodriguez rejoined Jake and commented that the meeting had been rather unexpected. Jake agreed and looked down at the data chip in his hand and said that maybe it was the right kind of unexpected, because it served as a good reminder that families were not monolithic and that children were not necessarily doomed to repeat their parents' mistakes. Rodriguez asked if he really thought Nicole would make it through the training. Jake said that if she was even half as determined as she seemed, then yes, she would make it. And if she did, she would probably be a very good engineer, because she would understand something that Victoria had never understood. Rodriguez asked what that was. Jake said that the real measure of a person was not where they started in life, but rather what they chose to build with the opportunities they were given. The weeks passed, and Jake continued working on the refit, and eventually the data chip that Nicole had given him proved incredibly valuable, because it revealed several other subtle problems in the quantum drive systems that nobody had noticed yet, and the engineering teams were able to fix those issues before they became serious problems. And 2 years later, Ensign Nicole Crane graduated third in her class from the engineering program, and she immediately requested assignment to the Vanguard, and Jake made sure that request was approved, and she joined the crew, and proved herself through hard work and dedication and competence. And eventually the crew forgot about her family name and just saw her as a skilled engineer who pulled her weight and helped keep the ship running. 3 years after the tribunal, Nicole Crane stood in the Vanguard's hangar deck with her hands thoroughly covered in grease as she carefully calibrated a dimensional stabilizer array. And she had graduated third in her class from the demanding engineering program and had immediately requested assignment to the Vanguard upon receiving her commission as an ensign. She had proven herself over the past 18 months on the ship, and the crew had definitely been suspicious at first when they learned her family name, because everyone remembered the scandal. But Nicole had gradually won them over through genuine competence and sincere humility, and she worked harder than anyone else and volunteered for the worst shifts and never complained about anything, and she learned eagerly from everyone, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. Now Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison watched from across the hangar as she worked, and he could see that she had excellent hands that moved with steady confidence, and she clearly understood the quantum drives not just as mechanical systems, but as complex machines that required intuition and feel as much as technical knowledge. Lieutenant Sarah Park joined Jake at his observation point and said that Nicole was going to be better than Sarah herself someday. Jake agreed and said she was already better than most engineers, and in another year or two, she would definitely be ready for a chief engineer position on a smaller vessel. Sarah asked if Nicole knew about the promotion board yet. Jake shook his head and said not yet, because he wanted to see if the board approved his recommendation before saying anything. But if they did approve, he was recommending Nicole for early promotion to lieutenant junior grade based on her exceptional performance. Sarah smiled and commented that the Crane family had come a remarkably long way from trying to defraud the Navy. Jake said that Nicole was not her sister, and she had consciously chosen a completely different path. And then he paused and added that he had actually received a message last week from Victoria herself. Sarah's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and she asked what Victoria had wanted. Jake explained that Victoria was being released from prison next month after serving 3 years of her 5-year sentence with good behavior, and the message had been an apology that seemed real as far as he could tell. And Victoria said that prison had given her substantial time to think about who she had become and about how she had allowed wealth and privilege to turn her into someone genuinely cruel and corrupt. Sarah asked if he believed the apology was sincere. Jake considered the question carefully and said he honestly did not know because people could sometimes change, but it was extremely hard, especially when someone had spent their entire life believing they were inherently superior to everyone else. But Victoria had said something interesting in her message, which was that watching Nicole succeed in the Navy and seeing her work alongside people Victoria had once dismissed as beneath her had made Victoria realize how completely wrong she had been about everything. Sarah asked what he was going to do and whether he would reply to the message. Jake said he had already replied and told Victoria that if she was genuinely serious about changing, then the best thing she could do would be to use her experience to help others avoid making her mistakes, and maybe teach business ethics or work with corporate reform initiatives and show people what happens when you lose sight of basic human decency in pursuit of profit. Sarah asked what would happen if Victoria did not actually change. Jake shrugged and said that if she did not change, then she would simply have to live with the consequences of that choice. But it was ultimately her choice to make, and he was not responsible for Victoria Crane's redemption or lack of redemption across the hangar. Nicole finished her calibration work and ran a comprehensive diagnostic check, and the stabilizer array hummed with absolutely perfect resonance, and she smiled with satisfaction and made detailed notes in her maintenance log. Jake's communicator suddenly buzzed, and Captain Rodriguez's voice came through saying that they had just received new deployment orders for a frontier patrol in the outer reaches, and it would be a 3-month mission starting next week, and she asked if they were ready. Jake looked around the hangar and saw his crew working with smooth efficiency, maintaining the drives that kept the Vanguard operational, and Nicole was patiently teaching a younger technician the proper calibration sequence, and the quantum cores all hummed with steady, reliable power, and everything was exactly as it should be. He told the captain that they were definitely ready, and the drives were in perfect condition, and whatever challenges the frontier threw at them, they could handle. The captain said outstanding, and told him to brief his team and start the pre-deployment checks. Jake gathered all his engineers for the mission briefing, and Nicole stood with the others maintaining straight posture and focused expression, and when Jake explained the mission parameters, she asked several intelligent questions about the quantum drive stress that extended frontier operations would produce. After the briefing ended, and the crew dispersed to their various tasks, Nicole approached Jake directly. She said that she wanted to thank him for giving her a chance when most people would not have, and for teaching her what it truly meant to be a real engineer. Jake smiled and said that she had earned her place on the ship through her own efforts, and nobody had given her anything as a gift, and she had proven herself through consistent hard work and unwavering dedication. And then he paused and added that her father would have been proud of her. Nicole's eyes glistened slightly, and she said that her father had passed away 2 months ago because the cancer had come back. Jake said he was sorry to hear that, and commented that Daniel had seemed like a fundamentally good man who made some serious mistakes but tried his best to make amends. Nicole said that he was exactly that, and at the end he had told her he was actually glad that Stellar Dynamics had collapsed, because the company had become something he never originally intended, and destroying it was the only way to stop the corruption that had taken root. And she smiled sadly and added that her father had also said that meeting Jake was probably the best thing that could have happened to their family, because Jake had shown them what real excellence actually looked like. Jake felt uncomfortable with that level of praise and said he had just been doing his job. Nicole said firmly that no, he had been showing everyone what doing your job correctly actually means, and the high standards he held himself to, and the respect he showed for every person on the ship regardless of their rank or position, and the way he defended his crew and demanded excellence from himself first before asking it from others, and she straightened her shoulders and said that was exactly the kind of officer she wanted to become. Jake told her that she was already well on her way, and now she should get back to work because those dimensional stabilizers would not calibrate themselves. Nicole snapped a crisp salute and returned to her station. Jake watched her go and then turned back to his own extensive work because there were literally 1,000 things that needed to be done before the deployment, and maintenance schedules had to be finalized and supply requisitions needed approval and pre-flight checks had to be properly supervised. It was exactly the work he loved and the work that truly mattered, and keeping the ship running smoothly and keeping the crew safe and solving complex problems with his hands and his mind and 12 years of hard-won experience gained through countless difficult situations. He thought back to that pivotal day in the hangar when Victoria Crane had tried to humiliate him with her marriage joke, and he had responded in just 3 minutes, not with anger or resentment, but with pure competence and personal dignity, and with a clear explanation of why genuine respect mattered far more than wealth or social position. That single confrontation had genuinely changed everything, because it exposed widespread corruption and led to important reforms throughout the military-industrial complex, and inspired Nicole to choose a much better path than her sister had chosen, and even convinced Victoria to begin questioning her own values, however imperfectly she might do so. But for Jake personally, the most important outcome was actually much simpler than all of that, because he had defended his crew when they needed defending, and he had stood up for every mechanic and technician and engineer who had ever been casually dismissed as less capable because of their rank or their background or the color of their skin. He had demonstrated clearly that real excellence came not from privilege or inheritance, but from dedication and hard work, and that true superiority was measured not in credits or corporate titles, but in actual skill and personal integrity and the willingness to do difficult work well. That was the legacy Jake wanted to leave behind, and not as some kind of legend or symbol, but simply as a working engineer who did his job to the absolute best of his ability and treated everyone with the fundamental respect they deserved as human beings. He picked up his tools and moved to the next quantum drive that needed attention, and his hands already knew instinctively what needed to be done. And around him his crew worked with practiced efficiency, and the Vanguard hummed with power, ready for whatever challenges the dangerous frontier would bring. And in just 3 days they would jump to deep space, carrying humanity's flag into the unknown, and doing the work that mattered and living the values that defined them as individuals and as a crew. The Vanguard jumped to deep space exactly 3 days later, and the crew settled into the familiar rhythm of frontier patrol operations, and the work was demanding and often dangerous, but it was also deeply satisfying because everyone knew they were doing something that genuinely mattered, and protecting humanity's expanding borders from threats both known and unknown. Jake continued working in the engine room, doing exactly what he had always done best, and his reputation throughout the fleet continued growing, but he remained completely focused on the actual work, rather than any kind of fame. And he trained his crew meticulously and maintained the quantum drives with obsessive attention to detail, and solved whatever problems arose with the creative problem-solving skills he had developed over many years of experience. Nicole thrived under his supervision, and she absorbed knowledge at a remarkable rate, and within months she could handle maintenance tasks that typically took engineers years to master, and the other crew members had completely forgotten about her family name and simply saw her as an exceptionally skilled engineer who consistently pulled her weight and helped keep the ship running smoothly through whatever challenges they faced. 6 months into the deployment, the Vanguard encountered a particularly severe situation when they responded to a distress call from a colony outpost that was under attack by Kravik raiders, and during the subsequent battle, both quantum drives took heavy damage, and Jake and his entire engineering team worked around the clock for 36 straight hours to keep the ship operational, while the combat continued around them. Nicole worked right alongside Jake during that entire brutal period, and she never complained once about the exhaustion or the danger. And when one of the dimensional stabilizers began failing catastrophically during a critical moment, she calmly diagnosed the problem and implemented an innovative solution that Jake had never even considered, and her quick thinking probably saved the entire ship. After the battle ended and the colony was secure, Jake recommended Nicole for a commendation, and the promotion board that had been considering her case approved her early advancement to lieutenant junior grade, based on her exceptional performance under extreme pressure. When Jake told her about the promotion, Nicole actually cried, and she said she could not believe she had come so far from where she started, and Jake reminded her that she had earned every bit of it through her own hard work and dedication. The deployment continued, and the months passed, and the Vanguard successfully completed its mission and returned to Earth for another scheduled refit, and Jake was already making plans for the next deployment because this was his life now, and he could not imagine doing anything else. One evening while the ship was docked, Jake received an unexpected message on his personal communication device, and when he opened it, he was surprised to see it was from Victoria Crane. The message was longer than her previous apology and much more detailed, and Victoria explained that she had been released from prison 2 months earlier and had spent that time trying to figure out what to do with the rest of her life now that she had lost everything she once had. She wrote that watching Nicole's success from prison through the occasional updates she received had been both painful and enlightening because it forced her to confront how wrong she had been about so many things, and she said she had spent countless hours thinking about that day in the hangar and what Jake had said to her about respect and competence and integrity. Victoria wrote that she had decided to dedicate the rest of her life to teaching business ethics at a university and working with corporate reform organizations to help prevent other companies from making the same mistakes that Stellar Dynamics had made, and she wanted to use her own failure as a cautionary tale to show young business students what happened when profit became more important than basic human decency. She said she was not asking for forgiveness because she knew she did not deserve it, but she wanted Jake to know that he had fundamentally changed her understanding of what it meant to be a good person and what really mattered in life. And she thanked him for that, even though she knew it had not been his intention to teach her anything. Jake read the message several times and thought carefully about how to respond. And finally, he wrote back a simple reply saying that he was glad she had found a constructive path forward and that teaching others to avoid her mistakes was probably the best way she could make amends for what she had done. And he wished her well in that important work. He did not mention the message to anyone else because it was not really relevant to his life anymore. And Victoria Crane was part of his past rather than his future, and he had moved on to focus on the things that truly mattered to him. 2 weeks later, Jake was working in the hangar when Captain Rodriguez approached with a serious expression, and she said that Fleet Command had contacted her again about Jake, and this time they were not just offering a promotion, but were directly ordering him to accept a position as the new Director of Fleet Engineering. Jake felt his heart sink because a direct order was very different from an offer, and he asked if there was any way to refuse it. Rodriguez said she had already tried arguing with Fleet Command on his behalf, but they were adamant that the Navy needed his expertise in a leadership position where he could have a broader impact on the entire fleet, and the order would take effect in 3 months, which would give him time to train his replacement on the Vanguard. Jake nodded slowly and said he understood, even though he hated the idea of leaving the ship and the crew he had worked with for so long. But Rodriguez smiled and said there was one detail she had not mentioned yet, which was that Fleet Command had agreed to let him design his own position and determine his own priorities, and if he wanted to spend most of his time in the field visiting ships and working directly with engineering crews rather than sitting behind a desk, then that would be acceptable. Jake blinked in surprise and asked if she was serious. Rodriguez said she was completely serious, and she had fought hard for that concession because she knew Jake would never be happy in a traditional administrative role, but Fleet Command genuinely needed his knowledge and experience to help reform the entire engineering division, and this way he could do that important work while still remaining connected to the actual hands-on engineering that he loved. Jake thought about it for a moment and realized that this could actually work, and he could help train the next generation of engineers throughout the entire fleet and ensure that the standards of competence and integrity that he valued were passed on to others, and he would still get to work on engines and solve problems and stay connected to the work that mattered most to him. He told Rodriguez that if those were the terms, then he would accept the position. 3 months later, Jake transferred to Fleet Engineering Command, but he spent less than 1 day per week in the main office on Earth, and the rest of his time he traveled throughout the fleet, visiting different ships and working directly with their engineering crews and teaching them the skills and knowledge he had accumulated over 15 years of service. He became known throughout the Navy as the admiral who still got his hands dirty, And young engineers were always excited when they heard Jake Morrison was coming to their ship, because they knew they would learn more in a few days with him than they would in months of regular duty. Nicole eventually became the chief engineer on a destroyer, and then later on a cruiser, and she continued advancing through the ranks and maintaining the high standards that Jake had taught her. And whenever their paths crossed, they would spend hours talking about engineering problems and sharing solutions, and she always said that everything good in her career had started with that day. Her father took her to meet Jake on the Vanguard, and Victoria kept her word and spent years teaching business ethics and speaking at conferences about corporate responsibility. And she never tried to rebuild her wealth or return to the corporate world, but instead focused entirely on helping others learn from her mistakes and preventing future corruption. Jake never became famous in the traditional sense, but throughout the fleet, his name was spoken with genuine respect by everyone from the newest recruit to the most senior admiral, because he had demonstrated through both his words and his actions what it truly meant to be an excellent engineer and a good officer and a decent human being. He had stood up for his crew when they needed defending, and he had exposed corruption when it needed exposing, and he had trained countless engineers to maintain the high standards that kept humanity's ships flying safely through the dangerous frontier of space. And perhaps most importantly, he had shown that real worth was not measured by wealth or position or the color of someone's skin, but rather by competence and integrity, and the willingness to do hard work well and treat everyone with fundamental respect. Years later, when Jake finally retired, after 30 years of service, the fleet held a ceremony in his honor, and officers and crew members came from dozens of ships to attend, and Nicole gave a speech about how Jake had changed her life and the lives of countless others through his example. And when it was Jake's turn to speak, he simply said that he had just been doing his job the best way he knew how, and that every person in the fleet who put on a uniform and did their work with dedication and skill deserved the same respect and recognition.